Hi, good morning. Welcome to our first Sunday forum of 2023. And we are kicking off today a series that will go from now until just before Palm Sunday with the theme of pilgrimage. And we'll be having different people from the community as well as from here within St. Stephen's sharing about either different pilgrimages they've been on or pilgrimage as a theme in scripture and just all sorts of iterations of that. So David Bains from Samford is back today to help us kick off our pilgrimage series, talking about a place of pilgrimage here in the United States, Washington, D.C., and different religious places, including our own Washington National Cathedral that you can make pilgrimage to, and that many people do make pilgrimage to on a regular basis. So David tells me there's a lot more detail he could go into with any one of these, so maybe we'll have him back to hear more on some of these in the future, but this kind of gives us the overview of Washington, D.C. overall as a place of pilgrimage. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great. Mute. Oh, now we're good. Okay, great. Sorry. All right. Okay. Should I repeat anything for the video or? Yes? Okay, great. So for those of you watching the video, the microphone is now on. And so I'm delighted to be back. And delighted to be introducing this theme of pilgrimage. I'm going to focus today on Washington, D.C., thinking a little bit about the concept of pilgrimage overall, and then talking about very briefly, four different religious sites. So on the opening slide here, we have three different kinds of religious sites, in a way, pictured. Up at the top is the Lincoln Memorial, which is, of course, not explicitly a religious site, though it's very much built in the form of a Greek temple, and is the site of a lot of important occasions, as well as people going there on a kind of civil religious pilgrimage. Civil religion is a term that I'm going to use to talk about the religious dimension of patriotism, that has, including a kind of theistic overview of it. The second image is of one of the chapels at the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception that we'll talk about a good bit more. This is the chapel dedicated to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And then down at the bottom is the one that my wife said I had to be sure to explain because you wouldn't know what you were looking at. This is a piece of needlepoint. It's a needlepoint cushion. We were debating as to whether we've seen it on a bench or on a kneeler. It was on a kneeler when I took this photo. But this at Washington National Cathedral, so over on the at the end of the rainbow, you do see Washington National Cathedral. And then we have one person walking down the path, and then three people dressed in traditional pilgrim garb with the scallop shell. The scallop shell being an emblem of St. James becomes associated therefore with the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, and so is just generally an image for pilgrimage in Christian art. And the one guy's hat, or person's hat, has the abbreviation for National Cathedral Association, Washington Cathedral. So that's what's going on there. So to move ahead, so I'll be focusing at the end, I'm going to say introductory stuff about pilgrimage and embed some introductory stuff about Washington, D.C. within that, talk about Washington, D.C. as a place of civic pilgrimage, and then say a little bit about four of the prominent, explicitly religious houses of worship in D.C. or just outside D.C. So I've already mentioned the Basilica of the National Shrine and Washington National Cathedral. We'll also talk about the Franciscan Monastery of the Holy Land and about the Latter-day Saints Temple. So what is pilgrimage? Pilgrimage is most basically a religious journey. I would say that's just the most basic definition we can give to it, particularly a journey to a shrine or holy place. Now, pilgrimage is very biblical since in Exodus 23:17, it commands that at 3 times a year, all the men of Israel should appear before the Lord, that is, appear before the tabernacle or later the temple. And these 3 festivals come to be known as Passover, Shavuot, and Succoth, or the Shavuot is Pentecost. That's what Luke's referring to when he says the day of Pentecost had come in the beginning of chapter 2 of Acts. And then Succoth means booths or tabernacles. Put the right word there, wrong word in my notes. Okay, so, and we also see Jesus and his family journeying to Jerusalem for Passover in the story at the end of Luke chapter 2 that we often read this time of year as it follows the Christmas and Epiphany stories. Interestingly, in the Common English Bible translation of the scriptures, a lot of the Psalms, which are headed, literal translation is Song of Ascents, they're labeled pilgrimage songs. But yet otherwise, our contemporary translations of the scriptures, such as the New Revised Standard Version or the New International Version, almost never use the word pilgrimage to translate any words at all, or pilgrim. Now, the King James Version famously uses the word pilgrim or pilgrimage a few times, though actually in just 5 verses. And most of them, it's the nature of the word is what we find in the famous verse in Hebrews chapter 11, where the author writes, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. They were persuaded of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they declare plainly that they seek a country." So 2 basic meanings of pilgrim then. One is somebody who's on a religious journey, and another one is gets to the sense of somebody who is away from home. Now, we'll focus mainly on that first one, but I want to use that second one to introduce part of the story of religion in Washington, D.C. If you search for pilgrim or pilgrimage online, and of course Google caters to different people, so this is what it gives me, I don't know what it'll give you, you'll find that one of the first things that pops up is a church called Church of the Pilgrims that has had a program for people to come there called the Pilgrimage for many years. The Church of the Pilgrims was erected in the 1920s with support from Presbyterians from throughout the South. It was affiliated with the denomination that was the Southern Presbyterian Church, which then in 1983 merged with others. So this is now PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA. And the sense of the term pilgrim in the name of this church was that it was a church for people who were strangers to D.C., people who had relocated to D.C. from throughout the South and were seeking a home. And so that was the reason why Second Presbyterian, as it was known, took the name Church of the Pilgrims. Now, this is a very common story in Washington, and this would be a whole other talk, that beginning in roughly the 1840s, people in Washington from every denomination you can think of would say, hey, we need a bigger church that will attract all of us people who have moved to Washington from around the country for jobs, to work in the government. And of course, many of those people are fairly transient because as the Congress changes every 2 years, then people are moving out. So we need a big church that will also stand out and insert us into the city. And so lots of people did this. Arguably, the Northern Methodists were the first. The Southern Methodists came along, finished their church in 1919. Both of these congregations still exist. United Methodist Church is now, the first one has moved, but is now known as the National Methodist Church. The United Brethren in Christ, you may not have heard of them. Think the Wright brothers, Kitty Hawk, their dad was a bishop in the United Brethren in Christ. They had one. They're also now United Methodists, moved out of the city. The most important African Protestant church in this story would be the African Methodist, or Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was dedicated in 1886. and is really the only historic black church left downtown. Unitarians built a number of buildings with national support. This was their last one and current one. Universalists, of course, these are the same denomination now, but back when they were separate, they wanted a separate national church. Going back in time a bit, we have the United Lutherans, Luther Place, which is still going strong. And right across the street from it is National City Christian Church, designed by John Russell Pope, the same architect who built the National Gallery of Art and Jefferson Memorial. And this church played a prominent role in the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, because that's where he often went to church. Let's see what I have. Oh, yes, and then not to be forgotten, National Memorial Church of God. Now, you've probably never, you may be asking, which Church of God denomination? It's the Indiana one, not the Tennessee one, but even they have these churches. So there's all this drive, and as tourism begins to increase after the Civil War and Washington becomes a more monumental landscape, then there's more and more of these churches being built, in part to insert themselves into the landscape of the city. That's 1880. Okay. But I want to say a little bit about theorizing and how we approach pilgrimage within religious studies. In modern anthropology and religious studies, one of the first major works on pilgrimage was the 1978 book, Image and Pilgrimage in Christian Culture, by Victor and Edith Turner. And there they are with their sons. I was thinking when I was a first year in college in the spring semester, actually, I had a course with Mrs. Turner. Victor Turner died fairly young. And so Victor Turner, in his very famous book, The Ritual Process, develops the very influential ideas of liminality. He's talking about rites of passage from childhood to adulthood, from singleness to married, from commoner to king, and in these rites of initiation, he would focused on what they like to call the betwixt and between. I can still hear Mrs. Turner saying that, betwixt and between states. And so this is this threshold position, and the Latin word for threshold is limen, so liminality. And the character of liminality, he talked about as communitas, that when you are in this rite of passage and you are between statuses, then people experience a degree of what he sometimes called anti-structure, that the normal structures of society are absent, or maybe there is a different kind of structure that takes place. And he saw this experience of communitas as really important more broadly in societies for various purposes, and also in social processes as a way in which new things, new creative things could emerge. And so in 5 years after Ritual Process, they published their book on pilgrimage, which extends that to the pilgrim, that in a pilgrimage you have this disaggregation where you're leaving home and going on a journey. And so everything is different, and you're experiencing a different way of being, and then you return home again and are reaggregated, but are perhaps transformed. Now, if that description of liminality as applied to pilgrimage sort of sounds like being on vacation, then that's appropriate, because recent work on pilgrimage, such as the very recent book, Powers of Pilgrimage, Religion in a World of Movement by Simon Coleman, really wants to look at the porousness of this category, pilgrimage. It's often hard to draw a line between pilgrimage and other kinds of significant movement, either vacation or indeed forced migration or migration. So in this book, he shows that we need to, quote, reflect on how pilgrimage sites, journeys, rituals, stories, and metaphors are entangled with each other and with wider aspects of people's lives, ranging from an action as trivial as a stroll down the street to the magnitude of forced migration to another country or continent. So to turn to Washington, D.C., we also need to think not only of the porousness of of travel as pilgrimage versus travel as vacation or business travel, but also the porousness of sort of patriotism and religion, or the religious dimension of American identity. Jeffrey Meyer has a wonderful book on this, Myths and Stones, The Religious Dimension of Washington, D.C., where he reads everything on the mall from a sort of history of religion's perspective. But this is, quite explicit. I already talked about the architecture of the Lincoln Memorial as being very much in the Greek temple form, likewise with the Jefferson. And indeed, in the early Republic, when we were building the Capitol, it was often referred to as the Temple of Liberty, as Pamela Scott explains in her fine book on that subject. An early reference to D.C. as a place of pilgrimage occurred in a 1835 speech by U.S. Representative John Dixon, who was arguing for abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia, something that didn't happen until during the Civil War. And he writes that no bondage, no stripes, no fetters or chains, no tears or screams of the oppressed should fatigue the eye or pain the ear of any citizen who makes a pilgrimage to this Mecca, this land of the faithful, to render homage at the shrine of liberty. And so that's early 19th century, 20th century writing on pilgrimage, is always talking about it as going to a Mecca, building on the idea of the Islamic pilgrimage. As rail travel increased and the National Mall took its now familiar form in the 20th century, the language of pilgrimage was increasingly used. A popular guidebook from the early 1920s, which went through many editions, was entitled, as you see, Washington, the Place of Pilgrimage for Patriotic Americans. Traveling to see the shrines and the museums that were increasingly being built, touring the Capitol and other government buildings was marketed, definitely, as a way of exercising and strengthening the religious-like commitments between Americans and the nation, and indeed as a way of Americanizing immigrants. The heyday for using the word pilgrimage to talk about Washington was probably the 1950s, when the Cold War against communism brought the language of faith and patriotism very closely together. For example, in 1951, an annual Washington pilgrimage of American churchmen began, and this happened annually for about 15 years. And this first one was addressed by President Truman, and they visited sites such as the Lincoln Memorial, Arlington Cemetery, and Washington National Cathedral. A little bit of trivia. As you may know, the phrase "under God" was inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. And the first draft of the sermon, the first time the sermon that really happened to catapult that effort was given was at the 1953 Washington pilgrimage. It had its effect when it was repreached before President Eisenhower the next year. And then we also, in the 50s, in May of 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. takes part in the prayer pilgrimage for freedom, which was the first time that he spoke to a national audience in front of the Lincoln Memorial. This was occurring on the third anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision on desegregating schools. So appropriate mention of this connection to Washington and pilgrimage here on what is actually Martin Luther King's birthday itself, the 15th of January. So the concept of visiting Washington as a kind of civil religious pilgrimage certainly continues to shape countless trips to Washington, especially of school groups who flood the city each spring. Last semester, I taught a freshman seminar at Samford, and we were talking about memorials, and a lot of the students talked about their very meaningful trips to Washington, D.C., either with school or with family, and one student very memorably about her participation in laying the wreath for her school at the Tomb of the Unknowns in Arlington Cemetery. So moving from talking sort of about general visits to Washington and tourism and pilgrimage to explicit religious sites. We'll come to these four churches. I should mention that I was first introduced to the first two churches by my pastor when I was going through confirmation class at age 11. I grew up about 180 interstate miles from Washington, so going there was pretty common. And so he'd relocated to our church from the immediate DC area, and so part of his confirmation class curriculum was to go on a tour of the first three of these and then some others. And so I'd been to the National Cathedral before in D.C. many times because, like I say, D.C. was pretty close to home. But that was the first time I was introduced to the idea of the Holy Land Monastery or the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception or the whole idea of this national churches stuff, because we went to the National Methodist Church as well. This was a Methodist church that I was going through confirmation in. So then many decades later, when looking for another research project, I started looking into religion in DC, in part because of that early confirmation class experience. So the first place we went to see was the Holy Land Monastery, which you see there. The Holy Land Monastery is the first of these churches pictured to be built. The Memorial Church of the Holy Land was built on a hill that the Franciscans renamed Mount St. Sepulchre, very near the Catholic University of America, which had been founded in the 1880s. As you may know, the Franciscans are the religious order who, on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church, are in charge of the shrines in the Holy Land, the Church of the Nativity, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And so in every country, there is a group of Franciscans whose job is to raise money to support the shrines. And so they established their first office in Manhattan, but in the 1890s, their leader, Father Gottfried Schilling, wanted to build the Holy Land of America, a church surrounded by gardens containing accurate replicas of the various shrines of the Holy Land. Oops. Sorry about that. We're still good? Okay, great. And so in this, he was motivated by examples from early modern Italy, where the Franciscans did the same kind of thing, that they would be places where people could go to experience the shrines, to pray at them, and to support the Franciscans' work by going to replicas of the shrines in their homeland so they didn't have to journey all the way to Palestine. So Schilling selected a site near Catholic University, and he moved his community there in 1898 and began building the Memorial Church. Now, in the Memorial Church, one can walk in just a few steps from the Grotto of Bethlehem to, so that's a direct replica of what, if you've ever been to Bethlehem, you would see there. It was in the King's Speech video if you watch King Charles's Christmas Day address. There's the Mount of the Transfiguration, then the Mount of Calvary, and then the key thing, the thing that gives everything its name, the Holy Sepulchre itself. So this woman on the tour where I took this picture is coming out of the Holy Sepulchre. You don't get to take pictures in there. And I couldn't find any online. And so you can go through, all the places. And of course, actually bowing down and getting into that little cave. I remember that the friar who was giving us the tour back in 1983, had to sort of say, because we're all looking, we don't want to walk into a grave. And he's like, he is risen. So walk into the tomb. And most shockingly for a Methodist kid, and you always start here, is the Purgatory Chapel. It's where a chapel dedicated to praying for the holy souls in purgatory, and it actually depicts a scene from purgatory there on the altar and other related scriptural things around it. So the Holy Land Monastery and Church is one of several sites that seek to materialize the Bible in America. And this is a theme that's explored more in my colleague James Bilow's recent study. So a visit to the Holy Land Monastery, as to most other churches, consciously sits on the border of tourism and pilgrimage. One goes there to see a curiosity, a reproduction, but particularly if one's accompanied by a guide, then one is also taking it as a form of a guided pilgrimage. But the main site of Catholic pilgrimage to Washington, D.C. is not the Holy Land Monastery, but is about a mile away and just on the central campus or adjacent to the central campus of Catholic University, which is the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. So this was first proposed in 1910. The lower church opened to have the first masses in 1924, and then it was completed, the upper church was completed in 1959. An expansion of additional chapels and decorations continued until just about, I think, 8 years ago. So the shrine is dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary under her title, the Immaculate Conception, in which she, that is the title by which she is patroness of the United States. So the United States is dedicated at the Immaculate Conception, that is the national patron. And so the shrine includes more, in addition to that Marian dedication, it has more than 80 chapels and oratories that are dedicated, most of them to Mary, under various titles by which she's venerated from America's many Catholic groups, many ethnic groups, many ethnic identities. So up here we have the Filipino, Hungarian, and Lebanese chapels. Now, unlike Marian shrines at Lourdes or Fatima or Mexico City, the DC shrine is not built on a site that was made holy by the appearance of the Blessed Virgin to devotees. But it's nevertheless a place Catholics can go to make special prayers to Mary. And so the idea of going on a pilgrimage as a kind of sacrificial offering to a saint or to God, to a place where prayers might be especially honored, is alive at the shrine. And so if you were to go, there's the interior of the upper church, that's Jesus there. But if you go to the website, you can get information on family pilgrimage, on school or church group pilgrimage, and on one-day diocesan pilgrimage. And from time to time, most of the dioceses that are within a half-day's drive of Washington do organize pilgrimages to there. Actually, I remember there were a group of Catholics going on a pilgrimage to the shrine the same day that we were going, and they stopped at the same rest areas that we did, going up the interstate from a church in our hometown, and then we saw them at the shrine. That was all back in the early 80s. Okay, so I'm going to skip a brief talk about St. Matthew's Cathedral in the interest of time and move on to Washington National Cathedral. So Washington National Cathedral is the largest and most famous church in Washington. The Cathedral Church of St. Peter and St. Paul is the cathedral of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. It's now commonly known as Washington National Cathedral. It does have, among its several divisions, a Center for Prayer and Pilgrimage, but currently that plays a relatively small part in the cathedral's formal life. If you go there and click pilgrimage, you don't find out how to make a pilgrimage to Washington National Cathedral. You find out how to make a pilgrimage with them to Iona. At least this morning, that's what you find out. And at a time when it was being built, particularly in the 1920s, Washington National Cathedral tried to sell itself as America's Westminster Abbey. That is the final resting place of illustrious Americans, the place where Americans would be remembered. But its earliest and most consistent identities have been encapsulated by two phrases: a house of prayer for all people, which is back to being the key name on the web page, and to be a great church for national purposes. Now, this phrase, great church for national purposes, comes from the initial plan of Washington, D.C. that was prepared by Peter Charles L'Enfant under George Washington's supervision. It was never built, and that wasn't the phrase that when they first started to build the cathedral, or first incorporated in the 1890s, they were focused on, but it came to be a phrase in the next decade that they've used ever since. Now, couple things. I could talk about Washington National Cathedral all day, but just to say just a couple things. First, I want to dispel a misconception, one that in decades past the cathedral has sometimes encouraged. This misconception is, quote, Congress designated it as the National Cathedral. That is not true. This stems from the fact that in 1893, Congress did grant a charter, that is, incorporation papers, to the Protestant Episcopal Cathedral Foundation of the District of Columbia to build a cathedral and to establish educational institutions. Around the same time, Congress also chartered the Catholic University of America, George Washington University, and the American Red Cross. So given the fact that Congress was actually the law in Washington, and there really was no city government directly at the time, the only way to incorporate as a nonprofit, or at least the most prestigious way that many people did, was to actually get a charter from Congress. So this raises the question of how did the Cathedral of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington get to be the national cathedral? Well, to quote from a television interview that its late dean, Sam Lloyd, gave at the time of the cathedral's centennial of its building in 2007, it did so, quote, simply by offering itself. That is, the cathedral sought to be accepted not simply as the Episcopal Cathedral in Washington, but as the National Cathedral of the Episcopal Church, and it did become the seat of the presiding bishop in the 1940s, and as the church fulfilling the proposal in the original plan of being a great church for national purposes, such as funerals, which was one of the purposes stated very prominently in the 1791 plan. So raising funds to build a huge Gothic cathedral transcending its denominational and diocesan identity was a long, hard effort. Construction of the cathedral lasted from 1907, this is Teddy Roosevelt speaking at the foundation stone laying, on through 1922, 1931, 1950s. The tower, the central tower, Gloria in Excelsis Tower, finished in the mid-60s. The nave was completed in time for the bicentennial in 1976, and then the west towers were completed with the laying of the final stone in 1990. There's President Bush with the bishops on that occasion. There were many ways this was pursued, but an essential turning point I want to mention came in 1924 when President Woodrow Wilson, who had just died, was buried in the cathedral. And so here you see Wilson's casket being carried into the cathedral. He was buried here in the crypt of the Bethlehem Chapel. That's an early picture of the memorial there. And then that was the memorial tomb that was erected in Bethlehem Chapel. And so this led thousands, over 250,000 people in the year after Wilson's death to visit the cathedral, which only consisted at that time essentially of that one chapel plus other parts above it that were being built. And other chapels they were working on building underneath, or at the same level here. And then Wilson, if you go there today, Wilson is now on the nave level. There's his tomb there. And so it was by inserting itself into this national story, by becoming a shrine for a former president or his place of burial, that the cathedral was first able to rise up to above its denominational and local status, I would argue. Now, and for a while, Bishop Freeman, who was bishop from the 20s to the very early 40s and really the great fundraiser for the cathedral in that period, he was selected bishop for that job, basically. He really pursued getting the famous buried at the cathedral. And so he did succeed with Helen Keller, with John R. Mott, that was after his death, with Cordell Hull. He failed with Thomas Edison. He failed with FDR. That's a fun story. But what did happen is that once the cathedral have more open space, then it became the place for major funerals, beginning really with Secretary of State Dulles in '59. That's his funeral procession. And then also with President Eisenhower in '69, the first president to be buried from the cathedral, but not in it. And so that's really key to the cathedral's role in the nation today. Also, interfaith prayer services at the time of the presidential inaugurations that have been a big thing since 1984. And then, but I'm going to skip the art. But in terms of its of visitors normally to the cathedral today, they're drawn by the architecture, they're drawn by the memorials of all sorts, stained glass windows, kneelers, all of these things. And then, of course, the cathedral is a place for major Christian and interfaith worship services, all led by its, under the Episcopal Church, though the cathedral does have non-Episcopal clergy as members of its staff now. So the church welcomes many visitors, but outside of worship services, which are again quite numerous, the mode at the cathedral, I would argue, is more of touring historic architecture and its various memorials than explicitly religiously devout pilgrimage. But this fine line between tourism and pilgrimage is always ambiguous at any significant or religious site. And so I'll close with just saying a little bit about that in relationship to the most prominent church, perhaps, in Washington, D.C., which is the Washington Temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was completed in '74. And if you know the Capitol Beltway, it hovers over it, right? You cannot miss it when you're going south around that curve on the Capitol Beltway. Now, of course, as you may know, Mormon temples are not places that Gentiles, to use the Mormon term for non-Mormons, can go into, except prior to them being consecrated or prior to them being reconsecrated. And so this May and June, the temple was open prior to being reconsecrated. And so I was able to go, as Martha came with me, and thousands of other people go. And so you're going through and seeing, I don't have a lot of interior pictures, I had to download them, but you're seeing the inside of the temple, which is not, I mean, it's a bunch of different rooms for different things. So it's not a wow being inside of any Mormon temple. Yeah, Martha laughed. That is quite true. One of my colleagues said it's kind of like being in a very nice or a pretty good convention center or hotel. But it is a holy place where very holy things occur. Essentially, a celestial room is the holiest. To be in the celestial room, once it's consecrated, is to be in heaven. But the thing I want to point out is that when you are going through this, they have all these people who are coming in to just see what's going on, and you have all these Mormons who are there helping you interpret things. And so there's a very fine line there walking between, touring and letting you see things and explaining things, and evangelism or witness that's going on. And if you've ever been to a Mormon historic site, and Martha and I have been to several, you encounter this even more so. And so it comes back to this kind of ambiguity, or to use Turner's phrase, this betwixt and between nature of a lot of our tourism to traditional sites that in some ways function as pilgrimage, particularly if they're religious or patriotic, and to some degree only function as tourism. And but that is a alluring way. I mean, the reason the Mormons opened their temple is in part to do witness, right? And so it's a way into a deeper relationship with the subject. So I will stop there, and I'll be delighted to take questions if we have time for questions.
Well, hold on a second, Virginia. Let me get the mic to you. Hold on. All right. That's why people at home can hear.
You mentioned there was a good story with FDR.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So, yeah. So, I mean, of course, FDR was an Episcopalian, and Bishop Freeman was working hard. I mean, Bishop Freeman had a stroke of luck, right place, right time, in that Wilson's widow lived just a half mile from the cathedral. And so he did, and so Freeman did several times in whatever way he thought tactful, tried to suggest to FDR that FDR should plan on being buried at the cathedral. And FDR is heard to have uttered, and this was reported in Time magazine, that Freeman was that old body snatcher. So, yeah. Yeah. So that's the story. And FDR, after a meeting with Freeman one day, did write down in a statement of intent that he would be buried at Hyde Park. Yeah, so he did resist that.
Other questions? Let me bring you the mic if you have one.
Are there any tabernacles in D.C.?
Tabernacles in the sense
Jewish.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, yeah, there are, yes, there are a number of Jewish synagogues or temples or tabernacles, whatever they choose. Different ones use different names. Interestingly, on the extreme end of Upper 16th Street, right before the Maryland border, there was a Orthodox synagogue called Ohev Shalom Talmud Torah, and a merger of two different ones. And then about 15 years ago, this very much declining shul, as he would say, synagogue got a dynamic new rabbi, and he changed the name to National Synagogue, which the other Orthodox synagogue in town, which is the Georgetown Synagogue, because most of the Jews have moved out of the district, took considerable offense at, as did I think it's a conservative synagogue that is literally right across the street from the National Synagogue. It's like, who made you the National Synagogue? But of course, nobody becomes the National Synagogue or even arguably the National Cathedral by any other way than just saying, we're it. I mean, if you have a national bureaucracy, as Presbyterians and Catholics and Methodists do, then you can try to get that approved, and that sometimes goes well and sometimes doesn't, because people are like, I mean, one reason Washington National Cathedral did not use the name National Cathedral in anything from the 20s until 1989, right before they were to finish, because New York's trying to build their thing, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and in the Episcopal Church, while it did in the early 40s make Washington Cathedral the seat of the presiding bishop, it didn't call it the National Cathedral, and so even within the Episcopal Church, giving it that name was controversial to some. So it was always called just Washington Cathedral until '89. Yeah. So yeah.
Other comments or questions for David? Hold on, Tom.
So how many faiths have emphases on pilgrimages across the faith geography in the world?
Pilgrimages worldwide, you mean? Globally? Well, I mean, yeah, most religions have pilgrimage as an important part of them. I mean, of course, Islam has it most intrinsic as one of the five obligations that if you are financially and relationship able, you should go to Mecca at least once in your life. And of course, in Hinduism, pilgrimage is really key. It's not essential, but it's long been a practice in Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Now, of course, Protestants would be the people who, oftentimes, no, we don't want to do pilgrimages. And interestingly, another rejection of the idea of pilgrimage was in the early teachings of the Sikh tradition. If you know the Sikhs, wear turbans from Punjab, because they were very much, they were, like early Protestants, very much rejecting the idea of holy places. And holiness is to be found in a personal relationship with the divine. And so they actually rejected the idea of pilgrimage. Now, people do sometimes go, they do have their one chief Gurdwara in Amritsar. And so that comes to take a little pilgrimage fashion, but not, and this was a big differential between their two competitors, the Hindu tradition and Islam, both of which, of course, had pilgrimage as central to them. So that's a partial answer, but a gesture to that. Buddhism, pilgrimage is important as well in some traditions, yeah. Yeah, and I should say, to piggyback on the question about Judaism, of course, I focused on all Christian sites today, though the National Gurdwara Sikh Gurdwara was in my collage of pictures. That's an interesting story. It's right in the shadow of Washington National Cathedral, and it took a long time to build. They were very in particular on being on Embassy Row, like the cathedral practically is, and the Orthodox churches and the Islamic Center of Washington. But they were, but the U.S. Sikh community pretty much totally rejected the idea that they could be the National Gurdwara, and so they've changed that name, and along with other restructuring. And the key Hindu temples are all just outside the Beltway, basically because of when they were built. I mean, real estate in D.C. is very, very pricey most of the time. As the you know St. Elias Maronite Church here in town as the counterpart to St. Elias said in D.C., the pastor who was building a big new representative church. He's like, in D.C., everyone wants their pied de terre. Everywhere else you can buy a used church, but in D.C., you know, he couldn't find a used church for sale. Now, used neighborhood churches, there's a huge number of them that have been converted to condos, which is another story in Washington now. But that's, I had that conversation with him about 15 years ago, and that wasn't quite the trend then. Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, David, for sharing with us. And if you want to go back and listen, the presentation's on our YouTube channel. So thank you.
Thank you very much.